Woman and the New Race by Margaret Sanger. Preface by Havelock Ellis. Dedicated to the memory of my mother, a mother who gave birth to 11 living children. Preface. The modern woman movement, like the modern labor movement, may be said to have begun in the 18th century. The labor movement arose out of the Industrial Revolution, with its resultant tendency to overpopulation, to unrestricted competition, to social misery and disorder. The woman movement appeared as an at first neglected byproduct of the French Revolution with its impulses of general human expansion, of freedom, and of equality. Since then, as we know, these two movements have each had a great and vigorous career which is still far from completed. On the whole, they have moved independently along separate lines, and have at times seemed indeed almost hostile to each other. That has ceased to be the case. Of recent years it has been seen not only that these two movements are not hostile, but that they may work together harmoniously for similar ends. One final step remained to be taken. It had to be realized not only that the labor movement could give the secret of success to the woman movement by its method and organization, but that, on the other hand, woman held the secret without which labor is impotent to reach its ends. Woman, by virtue of motherhood, is the regulator of the birth rate, the sacred disposer of human production. It is in the deliberate restraint and measurement of human production that the fundamental problems of the family, the nation, the whole brotherhood of mankind find their solution. The health and longevity of the individual, the economic welfare of the workers, the general level of culture of the community, the possibility of abolishing from the world the desolating scourge of war, all these, like great human needs, depend primarily and fundamentally on the wise limitation of the human output. It does not certainly make them inevitable, but it renders them possible of accomplishment. Without it, they have been clearly and repeatedly proved to be impossible. These facts have long been known to the few who view the world realistically, but it is not the few who rule the world. It is the masses, the ignorant, emotional, volatile, superstitious masses, who rule the world. It is they who choose the few supreme persons who manage or mismanage the world's affairs. Even the most stupid of us must be able to see how it is done now, for during recent years the whole process has been displayed before us on the very largest scale. The lesson has not been altogether in vain. It is furnishing a new stimulus to those who are working for the increase of knowledge, and of practical action based on knowledge, among the masses. The masses, who alone possess the power to change the force of the world for good or for evil, and by growth in wisdom to raise the human race on to a higher level. That is why the little book by Margaret Sanger, whose right to speak with authority on these matters we all recognize, cannot be too widely read. To the few who think, though they may here and there differ on points of detail, it is all as familiar as ABC. But to the millions who rule the world it is not familiar, and still less to the handful of superior persons whom the masses elect to supreme positions. Therefore, let this book be read. Let it be read by every man and woman who can read, and the sooner it is not only read, but acted on, the better for the world. Havelock Ellis. End of Section 1. Woman and the New Race by Margaret Sanger. Chapter 1. Woman's Error and Her Debt. The most far-reaching social development of modern times is the revolt of woman against sex servitude. The most important force in the remaking of the world is a free motherhood. Beside this force, the elaborate international programs of modern statesmen are weak and superficial. Diplomats may formulate leagues of nations, and nations may pledge their utmost strength to maintain them. Statesmen may dream of reconstructing the world out of alliances, hegemonies, and spheres of influence. But woman, continuing to produce explosive populations, will convert these pledges into the proverbial scraps of paper, or she may, by controlling birth, lift motherhood to the plane of a voluntary, intelligent function, and remake the world. When the world is thus remade, it will exceed the dream of statesman, reformer, and revolutionist. Only in recent years has woman's position as the gentler and weaker half of the human family been emphatically and generally questioned. Men assumed that this was woman's place. Woman herself accepted it. It seldom occurred to anyone to ask whether she would go on occupying it forever. Upon the mere surface of woman's organized protest there was no indication that she was desirous of achieving a fundamental change in her position. She claimed the right of suffrage and legislative regulation of her working hours, and asked that her property rights be equal to those of man. None of these demands, however, affected directly the most vital factors of her existence. Whether she won her point or failed to win it, she remained a dominated weakling in a society controlled by men. Woman's acceptance of her inferior status was the more real because it was unconscious. She had chained herself to her place in society and the family through the maternal functions of her nature, and only chains the strong could have bound her to her lot as a brood animal for the masculine civilizations of the world. In accepting her role as the weaker and gentler half, she accepted that function. In turn, the acceptance of that function fixed the more firmly her rank as an inferior. Caught in this vicious circle, woman has, through her reproductive ability, founded and perpetuated the tyrannies of the earth. Whether it was the tyranny of a monarchy, an oligarchy, or a republic, the one indispensable factor of its existence was, as it is now, hordes of human beings so plentiful as to be cheap, and so cheap that ignorance was their natural lot. Upon the rock of an unenlightened, submissive maternity have these been founded. Upon the product of such a maternity have they flourished. No despot ever flung forth his legions to die in foreign conquest. No privilege-ruled nation ever erupted across its borders to lock in death embrace with another, but behind them loomed the driving power of a population too large for its boundaries and its natural resources. No period of low wages or of idleness with their want among the workers, no peonage or sweatshop, no child labor factory ever came into being save from the same source. Nor have famine and plague been as much acts of God as acts of too prolific mothers. They also, as all students know, have their basic causes in overpopulation. The creators of overpopulation are the women who, while wringing their hands over each fresh horror, submit anew to their task of producing the multitudes who will bring about the next tragedy of civilization. While unknowingly laying the foundations of tyrannies and providing the human tinder for racial conflagrations, woman was also unknowingly creating slums, filling asylums with insane, and institutions with other defectives. She was replenishing the ranks of the prostitutes, furnishing grist for the criminal courts and inmates for prisons. Had she planned deliberately to achieve this tragic total of human waste and misery, she could hardly have done it more effectively. Woman's passivity under the burden of her disastrous task was almost altogether that of ignorant resignation. She knew virtually nothing about her reproductive nature, and less about the consequences of her excessive childbearing. It is true that, obeying the inner urge of their natures, some women revolted. They went even to the extreme of infanticide and abortion. Usually the revolts were not general enough. They fought as individuals, not as a mass. In the mass they sank back into blind and hopeless subjection. They went on breeding with staggering rapidity those numberless, undesired children who became the clogs and the destroyers of civilizations. Today, however, woman is rising in fundamental revolt. Even her efforts at mere reform are, as we shall see later, steps in that direction. Underneath each of them is the feminine urge to complete freedom. Millions of women are asserting their right to voluntary motherhood. They are determined to decide for themselves whether they shall become mothers, under what conditions, and when. This is the fundamental revolt referred to. It is for women the key to the temple of liberty. Even as birth control is the means by which woman attains basic freedom, so it is the means by which she must and will uproot the evil she has wrought through her submission. As she has unconsciously and ignorantly brought about social disaster, so must and will she consciously and intelligently undo that disaster and create a new and better order. The task is hers. It cannot be avoided by excuses, nor can it be delegated. It is not enough for woman to point to the self-evident domination of man, nor does it avail to plead the guilt of rulers and the exploiters of labor. It makes no difference that she does not formulate industrial systems, nor that she is an instinctive believer in social justice. In her submission lies her error and her guilt. By her failure to withhold the multitudes of children who have made inevitable the most flagrant of our social evils, she incurred a debt to society. regardless of her own wrongs, regardless of her lack of opportunity, and regardless of all other considerations, she must pay the debt. She must not think to pay this debt in any superficial way. She cannot pay it with palliatives, with child labor laws, prohibition, regulation of prostitution, and agitation against war. Political nostrums and social panaceas are but incidentally and superficially useful. They do not touch the source of social disease. War, famine, poverty, and oppression of the workers will continue while woman makes life cheap. They will cease only when she limits her reproductivity, and human life is no longer a thing to be wasted. Two chief obstacles hinder the discharge of this tremendous obligation. The first and the lesser is the legal barrier. Dark Age laws would still deny to her the knowledge of her reproductive nature. Such knowledge is indispensable to intelligent motherhood, and she must achieve it, despite absurd statutes and equally absurd moral canons. The second and most serious barrier is her own ignorance of the extent and effect of her submission. Until she knows the evil her subjugation has wrought to herself, to her progeny, and the world at large, she cannot wipe out that evil. To get rid of these obstacles is to invite attack from the forces of reaction, which are so strongly entrenched in our present-day society. It means warfare in every phase of her life. Nevertheless, at whatever cost, she must emerge from her ignorance and assume her responsibility. She can do this only when she has awakened to a knowledge of herself and of the consequences of her ignorance. The first step is birth control. Through birth control, she will attain to voluntary motherhood. Having attained this, the basic freedom of her sex, she will cease to enslave herself and the mass of humanity. Then, through the understanding of the intuitive forward urge within her, she will not stop at patching up the world. She will remake it. End of Section 2. Chapter 2. Woman's Struggle for Freedom. Behind all customs of whatever nature, behind all social unrest, behind all revolutions, are great driving forces, which in their action and reaction upon conditions give character to civilization. If in seeking to discover the source of a custom, of a movement, or of a revolution, we stop at surface conditions, we shall never discern more than a superficial aspect of the underlying truth. This is the error into which the historian has almost universally fallen. It is also a common error among sociologists. It is the fashion nowadays, for instance, to explain all social unrest in terms of economic conditions. This is a valuable working theory, and has done much to awaken men to their injustice toward one another, but it ignores the forces within humanity which drive it to revolt. It is these forces, rather than the conditions upon which they react, that they are the important factors. Conditions change, but the animating force goes on forever. So too with woman's struggle for emancipation. Women in all lands and all ages have instinctively desired family limitation. Usually this desire has been laid to economic pressure. Frequently the pressure has existed, but the driving force behind woman's aspiration toward freedom has lain deeper. It has asserted itself among the rich and among the poor, among the intelligent and the unintelligent. It has been manifested in such horrors as infanticide, child abandonment, and abortion. The only term sufficiently comprehensive to define this motive power of woman's nature is the feminine spirit. That spirit manifests itself most frequently in motherhood, but it is greater than maternity. Woman herself, all that she is, all that she has ever been, all that she may be, is but the outworking of this inner spiritual urge. Given free play, this supreme law of her nature asserts itself in beneficent ways. Interfered with, it becomes destructive. Only when we understand this can we comprehend the efforts of the feminine spirit to liberate itself. When the outworking of this force within her is hampered by the bearing and care of too many children, woman rebels. Hence it is that, from time immemorial, she has sought some form of family limitation. When she has not employed such measures consciously, she has done so instinctively. Where laws, customs, and religious restrictions do not prevent, she has recourse to contraceptives. Otherwise she resorts to child abandonment, abortion, and infanticide, or resigns herself hopelessly to enforced maternity. These violent means of freeing herself from the chains of her own reproductivity have been most in evidence where economic conditions have made the care of children even more of a burden than it otherwise have been. But whether in the luxurious home of the Athenian, the poverty-ridden dwelling of the Chinese, or the crude hut of the primitive Australian savage, the woman whose development has been interfered with by the bearing and rearing of children has tried desperately, frantically, too often in vain, to take and hold her freedom. Individual men have sometimes acquiesced in these violent measures, but in the mass they have opposed. By law, by religious canons, by public opinion, by penalties ranging all the way from ostracism to beheading, they have sought to crush this effort. Neither the threat of hell nor the infliction of physical punishment has availed. Women have deceived and dared, resisted and defied, the power of church and state. Quietly, desperately, consciously, they have marched to the gates of death to gain the liberty which the feminine spirit has desired. In savage life as well as in barbarism and civilization has woman's instinctive urge to freedom and a wider development asserted itself in an effort, successful or otherwise, to curtail her family. The custom of infanticide prevails or has prevailed, says Westermarck in his monumental work, The Origin and Development of the Moral Idea, not only in the savage world, but among the semi-civilized and civilized races. With the savage mother, family limitation ran largely to infanticide, although that practice was frequently accompanied by abortion as a tribal means. As McLennan says in his Studies in Ancient History, infanticide was formerly very common among the savages of New Zealand, and it was generally perpetrated by the mother. He notes much the same state of affairs among the primitive Australians, except that abortion was also frequently employed. In numerous North American Indian tribes, he says, infanticide and abortion were not uncommon, and the Indians of Central America were found by him to have gone to extremes in the use of abortives. When a traveler reproached the women of one of the South American Indian tribes for the practice of infanticide, McLennan says he was met by the retort, "Men have no business to meddle with women's affairs." McLennan ventures the opinion that the practice of abortion so widely noted among Indians in the Western Hemisphere must have supervened on a practice of infanticide. Similar practices have been found to prevail wherever historians have dug deep into the life of savage people. Infanticide, at least, was practiced by African tribes, by the primitive peoples of Japan, India, and Western Europe, as well as in China and in early Greece and Rome. The ancient Hebrews are sometimes pointed out as the one possible exception to this practice, because the Mosaic law, as it has come down to us, is silent upon the subject. Westermarck is of the opinion that it hardly occurred among the Hebrews in historic times, but we have reason to believe that in an earlier period, among them as among other branches of the Semitic race, child murder was frequently practiced as a sacrificial rite. Westermarck found that the murder of female infants, whether by the direct employment of homicidal means, or exposure to privation and neglect, has for ages been a common practice or even a genuine custom among various Hindu castes. Still further light is shed upon the real sources of the practice, as well as upon the improvement of the status of women through the practice, by an English student of conditions in India. Captain S. Charles McPherson, of the Madras Army, in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society for 1852 said, "I can here but very briefly advert to the customs and feelings which the practice of infanticide, among the Khans of Orissa, alternately springs from and produces. The influence and privileges of women are exceedingly great among the Khans, and are, I believe, greatest among the tribes which practice infanticide. Their opinions have great weight in all public and private affairs. Their direct participation is often considered essential in the former." If infanticide did not spring from a desire within the woman herself, from a desire stronger than motherhood, would it prevail where women enjoy an influence equal to that of men? And does not the fact that the women in question do enjoy such influence point unmistakably to the motive behind the practice? Infanticide did not go out of fashion with the advance from savagery to barbarism and civilization. Rather it became, as in Greece and Rome, a recognized custom with advocates among leaders of thought and action. So did abortion, which some authorities regard as a development springing from infanticide and tending to supersede it as a means of getting rid of undesired children. As progress is made toward civilization, infanticide then actually increased. This tendency was noted by Westermarck, who also calls attention to the conclusions of Fison and Howitt and Kamilaroi and Kernai. Mr. Fison, who has lived for a long time among uncivilized races, says Westermarck, thinks it will be found that infanticide is far less common among the lower savages than among the more advanced tribes. Following this same tendency into civilized countries, we find infanticide either advocated by philosophers and authorized by law, as in Greece and Rome, or widely practiced in spite of the law, civil and ecclesiastical. The status of infanticide as an established legalized custom in Greece is well summed up by Westermarck, who says, "The exposure of deformed or sickly infants was undoubtedly an ancient custom in Greece. In Sparta, at least, it was enjoined by law. It was also proved up by the most enlightened among the Greek philosophers. Plato condemns all those children who are imperfect in limbs, as well as those who are born of depraved citizens." Aristotle, who believed that the state should fix the number of children each married pair should have, has this to say in Politics, Book 7, Chapter 5. "With respect to the exposing and nurturing of children, let it be a law that nothing mutilated shall be nurtured. And in order to avoid having too great a number of children, if it be not permitted by the laws of the country to expose them, it is then requisite to define how many a man may have, and if any have more than the prescribed number, some means must be adopted that the fruit be destroyed in the womb of the mother before sense and life are generated in it." Aristotle was a conscious advocate of family limitation, even if it attained by violent means. "It is necessary," he says, "to take care that the increase of the people should not exceed a certain number, in order to avoid poverty and its concomitants, sedition, and other evils." In Athens, while the citizen wives were unable to throw off the restrictions of the laws which kept them at home, the great number of hetera, or stranger women, were the glory of the Golden Age. The homes of these women, who were free from the burden of too many children, became the gathering places of philosophers, poets, sculptors, and statesmen. The hetera were their companions, their inspiration, and their teachers. Aspasia, one of the greatest women of antiquity, was such an emancipated individuality. True to the urge of the feminine spirit, she, like Sappho, the poetess of Lesbia, sought to arouse Greek wives to the expression of their individual selves. One writer says of her efforts, "This woman determined to do her utmost to elevate her sex. The one method of culture open to women at that time was poetry. There was no other form of literature, and accordingly she systematically trained her pupils to be poets, and to weave into the verse the noblest maxims of the intellect and the deepest emotions of the heart. Young pupils with richly endowed minds flocked to her from all countries and formed a kind of woman's college." There can be no doubt that these young women were impelled to seek the society of Sappho, from disgust with the low drudgery and monotonous routine to which woman's life was sacrificed, and they were anxious to rise to something nobler and better. Can there be any doubt that the unfortunate citizen wives of Athens, bound by law to their homes, envied the brilliant careers of the stranger women, and sought all possible means of freedom? And can there be any doubt that they acquiesced to the practice of infanticide as a means to that end? Otherwise, how could the custom of destroying infants have been so thoroughly embedded in that jurisprudence, the thought, and the very core of Athenian civilization? As to the Spartan women, Aristotle says that they ruled their husbands and owned 2/5 of the land. Surely, had they not approved of infanticide for some very strong reasons of their own, they would have abolished it. Athens and Sparta must be regarded as giving very strong indications that the Grecian women not only approved of family limitation by the destruction of unwanted children, but that at least part of their motive was personal freedom. In Rome, an avowedly militaristic nation, living by conquest of weaker states, all sound children were saved, but the weakly or deformed were drowned. Says Seneca, "We destroy monstrous births, and we also drown our children if they are born weakly or unnaturally formed." Wives of Romans, however, were relieved of much of the drudgery of child-rearing by the slaves which Rome took by the thousands and brought home. Thus they were free to attain an advanced position, and to become the advisers of their husbands in politics, making and unmaking political careers. When we come to look into the proverbial infanticide of the Chinese, we find the same positive indications that it grew out of the instinctive purpose of woman to free herself from the bondage of too great reproductivity. In the poorest districts of China, says Westermarck, female infants are often destroyed by their parents immediately after their birth, chiefly on account of poverty. Though disapproved of by educated Chinese, the practice is treated with forbearance or indifference by the man of the people and is acquiesced in by the mandarins. When seriously appealed to on the subject, says the Rev. J. Doolittle in Social Life of the Chinese, though all deprecate it as contrary to the dictates of reason and the instincts of nature, many are ready boldly to apologize for it, and declare it to be necessary, especially in the families of the excessively poor. Here again the wide prevalence of that custom is the first and best proof that women are driven by some great pressure within themselves to accede to it. If further proof were necessary, it is afforded by the testimony of Occidentals who have lived in China, that Chinese midwives are extremely skillful in producing early abortion. Abortions are not performed without the consent, and usually only at the demand of woman. In China, as in India, the religions of the country condemned, even as they today condemn, infanticide. Both foreign and native governments have sought to make an end of the custom, but in both countries it still prevails. Nor are these eastern countries substantially different from their western neighbors. The record of Western Europe is summarized by Oscar Helmuth Werner, Ph.D., in his book, The Unmarried Mother in German Literature. Infanticide, says Dr. Werner, was the most common crime in Western Europe from the Middle Ages down to the end of the 18th century. This fact, of course, means that it was even more largely practiced by the married than the unmarried, the married mothers being far greater in number. Another problem which confronted the Church, he says in another place, was the practice of exposure and killing of children by legal parents. A sort of final word from Dr. Werner is this: infanticide by legal parents has practically ceased in civilized countries, but abortion, its substitute, has not. How desperately woman desired freedom to develop herself as an individual apart from motherhood is indicated by the fact that infanticide was the most common crime of Western Europe, in spite of the fact that some of the most terrible punishments ever inflicted by law were meted out to those women who sought this means of escape from the burden of unwanted children. Dr. Werner shows that in Germany, for instance, in the year 1532, it was the law that those guilty of infanticide were to be buried alive or impaled. In order to prevent desperation, however, they shall be drowned if it is possible to get to a stream or river, in which they shall be torn with glowing tongs beforehand. Notwithstanding the fact that at one time in Germany the punishment was that of drowning in a sack containing a serpent, a cat, and a dog, in order that the utmost agony might be inflicted, one sovereign alone condemned 20,000 women to their death for infanticide, without noticeably reducing the practice. Today, in spite of the huge numbers of abortions and the multiplication of foundlings' homes and orphans' asylums, infanticide is still an occasional crime in all countries. As to woman's share in the practice, let us add this word from Havelock Ellis, taken from the chapter on Morbid Psychic Phenomena in his book Man and Woman. Infanticide is the crime in which women stand out in the greatest contrast to men. In Italy, for example, for every 100 men guilty of infanticide, there are 477 women, and he remarks later that when a man commits this crime, he usually does it at the instance of some woman. Infanticide tends to disappear as skill in producing abortions is developed or knowledge of contraceptives is spread, and only then. One authority, as will be seen in a later chapter, estimates that the number of abortions performed annually in the United States at 1 million, and another believes that double that number are produced. Among the Hindus and Mohammedans, artificial abortion is extremely common, says Westermarck. In Persia, every illegitimate pregnancy ends with abortion. In Turkey, both among the rich and the poor, even married women very commonly procure abortion after they give birth to 2 children, one of which is a boy. The nations mentioned are typical of the world, except those countries where information concerning contraceptives has enabled women to limit their families without recourse to operations. It is apparent that nothing short of contraceptives can put an end to the horrors of abortion and infanticide. The Roman Catholic Church, which has fought these practices from the beginning, has been unable to check them, and no more powerful agency could have been brought into the play. It took that church, even in the days of its unlimited power, many centuries to come to its present sweeping condemnation of abortion. The severity of the condemnation depended upon the time at which the development of the fetus was interfered with. An illuminating resume of the Church's efforts in this direction is given by Dr. William Burke Ryan in his authoritative and exhaustive study entitled Infanticide: Its Law, Prevalence, Prevention, and History. Dr. Ryan says, "Theologians of the Church of Rome made a distinction between the inanimate and the animate fetus, to which the soul is added by the creation of God, and adopted the opinions of some of the old philosophers, more particularly those of Aristotle, as to animation in the male and female. But the canon law altogether negatived the doctrine of the Stoics, for Innocent II condemned the following proposition: It seems probable that the fetus does not possess a rational soul as long as it is in the womb, and only begins to possess it when born, and consequently in no abortion is homicide committed. Sextus V inflicted severe penalties for the crime of abortion at any period. These were in some degree mitigated by Gregory XIV, who, however, still held that those producing the abortion of an animated fetus should be subject to them, an excommunication reserved to the bishop, and also an irregularity reserved to the Pope himself for absolution. Today the Roman Church stands firmly upon the proposition that directly intended artificial abortion must be regarded as wrongful killing, as murder. [Footnote: Pastoral Medicine.] But it required a long time for it to reach that point, in the face of the demand for relief from large families. As it was with the fight of the Church against abortion, so it is with the effort to prevent abortion in the United States today. All efforts to stop the practice are futile. Apparently the numbers of these illegal operations are increasing from year to year. From year to year more women will undergo the humiliation, the danger, and the horror of them, and the terrible record, begun with the infanticide of the primitive peoples, will go on piling up its volume of human misery and racial damage until society awakens to the fact that a fundamental remedy must be applied. To apply such a remedy, society must recognize the terrible lesson taught by the innumerable centuries of infanticide and feticide. If these abhorrent practices could have been ended by punishment and suppression, they would have ceased long ago. But to continue suppression and punishment, and let the matter rest there, is only to miss the lesson, only to permit conditions to go from bad to worse. What is that lesson? It is this: woman's desire for freedom is born of the feminine spirit, which is the absolute, elemental, inner urge of womanhood. It is the strongest force in her nature. It cannot be destroyed. It can merely be diverted from its natural expression into violent and destructive channels. The chief obstacles to the normal expression of this force are undesired pregnancy and the burden of unwanted children. These obstacles have always been and always will be swept aside by a considerable proportion of women. Driven by the irresistible force within them, they will always seek wider freedom and the greater self-development, regardless of the cost. The sole question that society has to answer is, how shall women be permitted to attain this end? Are you horrified at the records set down in this chapter? It is well that you should be. You cannot help society to apply the fundamental remedy unless you know these facts and are conscious of their fullest significance. Society, in dealing with the feminine spirit, has its choice of clearly defined alternatives. It can continue to resort to violence in an effort to enslave the elemental urge of womanhood, making of woman a mere instrument of reproduction, and punishing her when she revolts. Or it can permit her to choose whether she will become a mother and how many children she will have. It can go on trying to crush that which is uncrushable, or it can recognize woman's claim to freedom, and cease to impose diverting and destructive barriers. If we choose the latter course, we must not only remove all restrictions upon the use of scientific contraceptives, but we must legalize and encourage their use. This problem comes home with peculiar force to the people of America. Do we want the millions of abortions performed annually to be multiplied? Do we want the precious, tender qualities of womanhood, so much needed for our racial development, to perish in these sordid, abnormal experiences? Or do we wish to permit woman to find her way to fundamental freedom through safe, unobjectionable scientific means? We have our choice. Upon our answer to these questions depends, in a tremendous degree, the character and the capabilities of the future American race. Section 4